Morning, everyone. My name is William Pomeranz, and I'm Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. And we are glad to have you here today for our discussion on the evolution of Putinism, constitutional change, and regime stability. We hope today's event will be run as a discussion. We will have an initial discussion with our panelists, and then after the end of the discussion, we will open it up for questions and answers from our viewers. Just a little background on today's event. All of our panelists are commenting on articles for the upcoming issue of Russian Politics. I'd like to extend my thanks to Wilson Fellow Regina Smith, who helped organize the volume and served as co-editor of the volume. And also great thanks to Cameron Ross, the editor of Russian Politics, the journal. You can find more information about all the speakers, including bios of the panelists, articles and titles and abstracts on the website for today's event. Before I get started, I just want to mention that you can follow and stay up to date with the Kennan Institute through our blogs, the Russia File and the Focus Ukraine blog. A reminder for the audience, if you have questions for our guests, you can submit them via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. Please include your name and affiliation when sending questions. As I said, we're going to start by having a discussion amongst all our panelists and then throw it open to Q&A. And in order to start the conversation, I'm going to throw out an opening question. And the question is, after doing this research, does this new constitution codify change or continuity in the system for the future? That is, do you see the process of institutional change, much ado about nothing, or the groundwork for a new stability strategy? So we're going to throw that question out to all our panelists, and we're going to start with Sarah Soki. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So I thought about this question, and I think that the answer is definitely that the constitutional changes are not much ado about nothing. It's very certainly an attempt at the groundwork for a new stability strategy, and we'll see if it works or not, is the real question. And so I think there's this assumption often that Putin has a stronger grip on power than he may actually have. There's a book that's coming out, I think next month, by Timothy Fry, called Weak Strongman, about how there are vulnerabilities and serious vulnerabilities in Putin's rule in Russia, in his popularity, in the regime's stability. The difficulty is, of course, that we'll know things are going to change when they change. It's very difficult to predict the future, but I think with these constitutional changes, there's a few realistic scenarios that we can think about. One is that these constitutional changes, we have to remember, and this is what Regina Smith and I write about, we have to remember there's these opposing forces of continuity and change. So the constitutional changes are not much ado about nothing, but they're also not a brand new strategy, right? So there is this strategy that they've relied on before, that they're relying on again, which may, in one realistic scenario, maintain a delicate balance that essentially would mean strengthening Putin's regime and maybe strengthening the popularity and stability of United Russia. And the evidence for that is that the strategy has worked largely up to this point. So they promise a lot of things, they deliver on some of them. And what Regina Smith and I write about is that they promise things in the area of social policy. And we write about the cases of pensions and housing reform in particular. Pensions, there's a lot of constitutional promises that they make, very explicit ones. Housing, they don't mention in the constitutional amendments, but they've had the same strategy of promising a lot, delivering on some of it with varying success in different places. And so that's one realistic scenario, as they maintain the delicate balance. Another realistic scenario is that the constitutional amendments are mostly important for strengthening elites, and it allows them to handle or suppress any potential objections to continuing stagnating conditions in healthcare and education and living standards and that kind of thing. And that would be that's a different scenario. That means that they're not providing things people want, but they're strengthening the elites. And of course, One possibility is that the constitutional changes are not enough to bolster Putin's survival, the survival of united Russia. And it's very hard to predict this ahead of time. I would think that it doesn't seem likely that the regime is crumbling right this moment, even with the protests about Navalny very recently. But certainly we know that the constitutional amendments are not much ado about nothing. Um, and we see in them very much these opposing forces of continuity and change. They're using old strategies, but also trying to bolster themselves up moving forward. And in the spirit of keeping things moving, I'll go ahead and stop there and let someone else jump in.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I immediately violated the first rule because I did not even give you a one-sentence bio. Sarah is an associate professor in political science at the University of Colorado in Boulder. So you talked about elites and how they're reacting to the constitutional amendments. Paul Good also talks about the elites and elite transformation and support of the regime. So I'm turn the question over to Paul. He is the Macmillan Chair of Russian Studies at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. Paul, floor is yours.
Thanks. I agree in large measure. I think that on the one hand, these are not meaningless changes, but I also don't think it's really a strategy, much less a strategy for stability. And I can kind of elaborate on both of those, but I think what often gets lost in the discussion about the constitutional amendments, because we really tend to focus on sort of the distribution of power, is that so much of the debate, both in terms of elite dynamics and in terms of the campaign to mobilize the nationwide vote, all that basically avoided the most substantive aspects of the reforms. For the most part, the public and the elite debate focused on patriotism. It focused on social issues, things like pensions, right? And this was a Herculean effort to draft, to promote, to vote. And I think all this ultimately shows, first of all, that patriotic legitimation is something that has been crucial to Putin's regime, and it remains crucial. And this is very much an exemplification of that. The fact that you had all these public debates and this public campaign that pointedly avoided discussing political and institutional changes, I think is really interesting and significant in and of itself. And everything focused more on social and patriotic issues. When Putin initially rolled out these proposals for constitutional reforms in his address to Parliament back in January last year, he then created a working group of 50 members, including politicians, civil society actors, as well as professional athletes and celebrities, and really didn't give them much in the way of walking orders. Basically said, these reforms should strengthen Russia as a presidential republic. And then the vast majority of the proposals had to do with social and patriotic themes, which had very little to do with making Russia a stronger presidential republic. And some of these really became sort of dominant, especially in the working group discussions, like Alexei Pushkov warning about alternative histories about the Second World War, and this emerging dialogue of Europe is being saved by Uncle Obama, things that have absolutely nothing to do with the constitutional distribution of powers. My own personal favorite was when the Olympic athlete Elena Isinbayeva quipped that she was grateful for being included in the working group because she'd never read the Constitution before, so this gave her an excuse to do so. But the final version, right, of the legislation that was ultimately adopted by the Parliament in March included nearly all of the social welfare and patriotic amendments that were discussed. But when it came then to mobilizing the popular vote, almost none of the actual institutional changes were discussed. And so we saw, for instance, a nationwide billboard campaign that had lots of kids carrying flowers, giving them to, their grandparents for their participation in the Second World War. We had social media campaigns that included, clips put together by Prigozhin's federal news agency, having, for instance, a child criticizing his mother for not voting for the amendments because corrupt ministers would remain in power forever and he would never have a chance to be a minister himself. And so, I think that this was pretty significant insofar as you also had, according to Levada polls, about 3/4 of the population, supported the amendments in principle, but only about 14% actually knew any of the amendments to begin with, knew what they contained. So there was an attempt to mobilize. It was an apolitical mobilization, and it's something that has been at the core of Putin's regime, I would say, at least since sort of the shift into patriotic legitimation since 2012, 2014. Now, that brings me to stability, which is that I think that on the one hand, this is, not meaningless. On the other hand, it's not a strategy. It's replicating or reproducing the regime as a going concern. And I think that now that patriotism and social issues have been written into the Constitution, it actually limits the regime's ability to adapt, right? It no longer has the luxury of tailoring its legitimating claims to circumstances, to changing circumstances as it did in years past, right? Instead, it's now constitutionally bound to those patriotic and social welfare proposals that secured elite compliance and mass validation. And that's going to make it, I think, potentially difficult going forward without changing the practical structures that contribute to what our colleague Vladimir Gelman refers to as bad governance. So with that, I'll hand it back to the floor.
Regina, you wanted to jump in?
I just wanted to jump in from the perspective of having read all the papers and underscore that these papers address, as Paul just signaled, all 4 stages of this process of constitutional change, from talking about this very performative council that collected public input and defined the changes, the promotion, the vote, and finally the change of the laws subsequent to the Constitution to make things congruent or consistent. So these papers as a set look at all of those different steps, I think, and I think it's important to understand the conversation.
Sarah, you wanted to jump in as well?
Oh, just very quickly. So I would push back on, I do think this is a strategy, actually. I would disagree about this. And I think it's a strategy that's been used before in that, and as Paul was talking about, sort of building patriotism certainly is crucial for Putin's support, but isn't itself a strategy, but the policy strategy. And it's interesting because these constitutional promises, they had constitutional promises about pensions previously, and now there's more constitutional promises. And I think it seems kind of funny from an outside perspective that they would include in a constitutional amendment a promise that implies things like an annual increase in pensions or indexation, which may or may not be an actual increase, but implies an annual increase in pensions. And so that's new in that particular promise had not been made as such, but there had been previously, they were constitutionally bound to social policy promises before. These are highly non-credible. I don't know how you would enforce this, as it's unconstitutional, you didn't pass this policy, but it does seem to send this very strong signal. And it seems important that if they omitted this, maybe people would raise an eyebrow. Perhaps they can't back off from doing this kind of social policy promise in the Constitution now. But again, we see that opposing forces of continuing change. This isn't totally unlike what they've done before, but it is kind of a new formulation of the same old strategy. But I'll stop there.
Ben.
Thank you very much, Will, and thanks, Regina, for leading this project. I think it's in a sense, good that we haven't really focused on Putin. I think more broadly, too much analysis on Russia focuses on Putin. But in this instance, I think it's criminal that we haven't said one of the major things that was achieved by these constitutional changes was allowing Putin to run again in 2024 and possibly stay in power until he's 83 in 2036. I'm not saying that the other features of constitutional change aren't important, definitely not, and those papers make that very clear, but we shouldn't lose sight of the centrality of that amendment made by Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, in that set piece of political theater in the State Duma, when Putin came down after her proposal into the body and said, I will reluctantly, if the Constitutional Court allows me, I will accept this amendment that will allow me to stay in power. And he admitted after the fact that the core logic behind that was to stop the elite from focusing on the question of succession. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of the centrality of that amendment, allowing Putin to remain in power for 2 more presidential terms, and the fact that that was motivated in terms of elite management. But now shifting to what Nikolai and I focus on in our paper, and if, Will, you want us to touch on whether we should be focusing on continuity or change, we can compare what Putin said on the 15th of January 2020 in his address to the Federal Assembly. And he said, these are very, I'm quoting now, these are very serious changes in the political system that would increase the role and significance of the country's parliament, the role and significance of the state's Duma. What Nikolai and I make clear in our paper is that that promise was a hollow promise. It was not fulfilled. And we highlight that by looking at the implementation process itself. So if Putin is saying at the beginning of 2020, Parliament's going to have an increased role, then that suggests that during the implementation process that we focus on, Parliament would have a more significant role. It doesn't. It had even less of a role to play than it usually does in lawmaking. And we saw complaints not only of opposition parties, but also of more loyal voices within the State Duma saying, hang on, Putin promised us more influence, and yet in order to implement these very constitutional changes, we're playing a very peripheral role. So that's one of the major points that we make in our paper. And the other point that we try and make is that rather than focusing on constitutional reform in itself, we have to situate it within these other changes that are happening at the same time that Nikolai and I portray as a broader attempt at regime transformation, even if it's transformation to for the current political leadership to remain in power. And so we're not seeing this new system entirely, it's just in order to retain power. And those other areas include things like changes to the State Council, the creation of new bodies that will perform in a sense like quasi-governments. So we see the way that decision-making is taking place. Putin, it seems, is trying to create these new centers of power that won't challenge him, but that will also balance each other. So I've mentioned the State Council. We can also look at RF, which is the Institute of Development that's bringing together these new bodies, as well as a commission under Dmitry Kozak that's focusing on international policy. And let me finish by making the point that we think that these changes are baking in flexibility for the future. So the State Council, in its current form, is not a place for Putin to be able to go to step away from the presidency and retain control of the country. But there is the potential for something like that to happen in the future. So it's both to bake in that flexibility for the future, as well as to deal with elite management, which was increasingly a problem and remains a problem for late stage Putinism. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Again, I didn't introduce Ben, but he is an assistant professor at University College London, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. You raised the issue of Putin and the nullification amendment and so forth. And I want to turn it to Fabian, who talked about the idea that after these constitutional amendments, it's a much more personal constitution. Fabian, would you kind of expand on that idea, that the constitutional reforms involve the personalization of the Russian legal political system?
Well, thanks a lot. Actually, I'd like to pick up a few ideas that Sarah mentioned, and two of them, she brought up Tim's basically idea of a weak strongman. I tried to frame it a bit differently in my paper. Basically, I frame it as a paradox of governance. Basically, if you look at the 1993 Constitution, you have what many call a super presidentialist constitution, maybe extremely strong presidency compared to other countries. And what I argue is basically, if you look at the changes that occurred, have been occurring sort of in the last 20, 30 years, that the presidency has been accumulating even more powers by federal law, by presidential decrees, and by decisions of the Constitutional Court. But what the paradox actually is that, and the constitutional changes, they actually increase presidential power even more. So that's one of the more finding that I actually make, and I think it's worth mentioning. But the paradox is that this kind of very strong formal constitutional power does not always increase capacity. That very much ties in with what Vladimir does in his paper. What he calls bad governance was actually a weak implementation capacity. We see it with the implementation of the May decrees, the 2012 May decrees. We see it with the national projects. and so on, we see a fairly weak implementation of strategic goals, if you will, in socio-economic governance. And the second point I really like what Sarah made is basically these opposing forces of continuity and change. And sort of my paper is about the presidency as such, and I really think it makes sense to keep the president as a person and the presidency as an institution. I think it really still makes sense to keep it apart. But I argue, even though, as Ben mentioned, the zeroing amendment of giving actually Putin the opportunity to run again in 2024 is kind of this amendment of the constitutional reform. Maybe it's not all about the future. The amendment, when you specifically look at the presidency or the executive. So I would argue that we need to kind of distinguish these three levels, what these amendments with regard to the presidency are actually about. And in fact, some are about the past, aligning the constitutional text with sub-constitutional presidential powers the president had been accumulating before, achieving some convergence, reducing incoherence and discrepancy in actually the legal framework. And I think the State Council is a good example. Many people have interpreted this as being, this is about the future, as a potential place where actually Putin could go and actually step down from the presidency. But I would actually argue this is rather about the past, aligning previous practices, previous instances of the president that he actually had by federal decrees and so on, and before just aligning it with the practice, the constitutional text with the practice. Present, and I will come to the end right now. As Ben mentioned, it's about the present because it's about elite coordination, signaling what it's, what basically the intention is, giving as many options as possible, without actually making clear what the actually future scenario is. I think these are kind of the key points I'd like to.
Thank you, Fabian. And a reminder for those who are listening, we will get to a Q&A. So if you have a question, you can submit them via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. Yvonne, you talked about personalization of power as well. So to what extent do you find that the court reforms, especially the reforms about the Constitutional Court, enhances Putin's power and basically subordinates the High Court to Putin's discretion and rule?
Yes, thank you, William. Well, in my work, I focus on the Constitutional Court and the implications of the new amendments for the Constitutional Court more specifically. So I kind of have this narrower focus than just, looking at the general context of what's going on with the constitutions, with the Constitution, sorry. But having this narrower focus allows me to actually see that there are, and I think that's useful for our discussion, to see that there are basically three important sources of innovation from which the amendments stem. The first of these sources, and the one that I cover the most in my paper, is actually the fact that before these amendments, Vladimir Putin actually had a very strong aversion to amending the constitution. So for a very long time, for 2 decades, he was not changing anything, well, except for number of regions and the term limits for the legislature and the president at some point. But generally, the constitution was very stable. And given that this window was basically closed all of the time, and given that the constitution actually is quite concrete in its provisions, there accumulated a huge backlog of stuff that people wanted to amend in the constitution. And in particular, in the case of the Russian Constitutional Court, lots of things were done using the secondary legislation. So the Constitutional Court Act has been amended extensively during the previous decades. And then when, for some reason, Vladimir Putin said, okay, and now we amend the constitution, all of this backlog was actually, it basically rushed in, and all of these things were brought in. And I think lots of things related to social provisions and to all of these more conservative new things brought into the constitution, they actually come from there, from all of these, from this pile of ideas that people accumulated. That's one source. And of course, this source looks more or less like continuity. It's more or less a source of continuity in these amendments. And really, when I look at the amendments related to the Constitutional Court, many of them has already been enacted with the secondary legislation. But then there is this second source, which Ben has already mentioned, the fact that the reason the window was opened was because Vladimir Putin wanted to get re-elected again in 2024, or at least to have such an opportunity. And to this one, and that's the one related to personalism, to this one, a number of other amendments are linked, because if Vladimir Putin gets re-elected, then he has to start thinking about what the political system will look like after 2024 and in 2024. And for instance, one important amendment related to the Constitutional Court is that now the president can effectively dismiss individual justices of the court, which was not the case previously. But that way he secures a much stronger control over the court. Previously, it was done through the chairman. Now the president can actually fire any of the justices if they do something wrong. And that, of course, makes the situation much more stable for him in 2024, given that, that's a point of instability. And then there is the third source of amendments, just the ideas that Vladimir Putin himself might have had related to what the constitution would look like. And I think these amendments are mostly those which strengthen him in terms of making Russia even more presidential. Like, for instance, strengthening his control over the regional legislatures. It's not like he really needs it, but probably he feels more comfortable having them. That's why they are introduced. At least that's how I see picture, based off what I have researched about the Constitutional Court. I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Ben, did you have a question or comment? No. Okay. That was it was the mic. Okay. So the question has been raised about the question of governance and the issue of the State Council. So I want to kind of drill down into the State Council because it was initially, as Ben and others have commented, the place where Vladimir Putin was going to land, essentially, to kind of exert control indirectly. And the State Council has now morphed into really a top-down power vertical system, whereby something has introduced the unified system of public power and has swept up other previously independent institutions, such as local self-government. So to what extent is the new unified system of public power in the State Council supplementing Vladimir Putin's power, or did Putin already have the ability to coordinate and to discuss issues top down from the center to the regions? And to what extent is it kind of just duplicative of other powers that the presidential administration has and the president had under the existing constitution? So I'll throw that question out there to anyone who wants to respond. The future of the State Council and the importance of the State Council. Nikolai.
Yeah, thank you so much, Will. I think this is very interesting point because at the beginning, even before Putin did announce the constitutional reform, there were a lot of speculation saying that it should be the State Council to be the body allowing Putin to stay in power after 2024. When finally the law on the State Council was adopted, it looks now like the State Council itself is almost the same body of power as it used to be after 2018 revision of the previous one. But what is new is the State Council Presidium, which is much bigger, which is much better organized. But I think it's too early to speculate about the importance of this body because it's still at the stage of formation. So we do not know how big and how well financed the apparatus of the State Council will be. But in general, in my view, it looks like extension of the presidential staff at the expense, by the way, of the government and of regional governments rather than anything else. So if there are two general trends which we can notice in all these changes, one is weakening of all other institutions and another one is strengthening of the so-called big president, being him president himself and all bodies of power directly controlled by him. The State Council, well, is a good piece of mosaics which should increase powers of the president, but we can only speculate now how exactly it will happen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Nikolai. Why don't we go to Vladimir Gelman then and talk about the changing of the structure of governance and whether it can actually lead to improvement in light of the changes in terms of the Constitutional Court, the State Council, and center-regional relations.
Yeah, actually, I characterized Russia's political economic order as an instance of bad governance. The system aimed at rent-seeking as a major goal and purpose of governing the country. To put it bluntly, it basically means that Russia is governed in order to steal as much as possible and as long as possible. And the problem is that constitutional changes contributed to extension of time horizon for Russia's rulers and at preventing major unwanted changes. What Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov brilliantly labeled as cementing Russia. And this cementing mean the continuity of these practices of bad governance, or rather turn of these practices from bad to worse because of a combination of incentives for subnational authorities as well as for nationwide state agencies. And I explored how it works in three different policy areas: strategic development planning, environmental regulations, and digitalization. There's three different stories, but what is common is that some developmental plans are either postponed or adjusted to vested interests of powerful pressure groups, or captured by some rent seekers who got very luxury state contracts. And overall, I would say that this idea of continuity of political status quo and preventing unwanted political changes by possible extension of Putin's rule up until 2036 provided a strong signal to all state machinery that, okay, we not aimed at improvements, and this basically means that they more and more pursued the self-interest without any serious leverages of implementing some developmental goals. This is a more fundamental problem, much beyond recent constitutional changes. But my understanding that it will be more and more acute over time, exactly because there is a very limited pool of incentives for improving quality of governance in every possible sense. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I want to bring in Fabian again and talk about the capacity of the, you talked about the capacity of the government and to introduce reforms. And do these constitutional changes from your perspective increase capacity, or does it kind of limit the ability to respond?
Well, it's a great question, and I think in my paper I only partly speak about the capacity, but I would rather agree with Vladimir that it actually exacerbates the problems we previously had with capacity, because I just repeat the paradox, because if you assume that the presidency gets stronger, you would actually assume that kind of the presidency has more capacity to actually implement its own decisions. But what I find in a different paper, for example, if you look at one specific instrument the president has, namely presidential assignments, Prohibition, so I found in the paper that only 50% of these kind of presidential assignments are actually implemented. Others are not implemented or either prolonged over quite a long time. When I think this over-centralization, what we actually see is personalization and focusing all sorts of powers in the presidency, actually gives maybe some more instruments of control, but it does not really give more instruments in terms of actually increasing the capacity to achieve what the main policy domains, for example, that Vladimir talks about. That's, I think, the major issue at hand. I think.
Thank you, Fabian. I'm going to jump in here. Ben has asked me a question, and I'm a contributor, so I'm going to use my prerogative of actually speaking and talking about one of the things that I find in the Constitution and with these constitutional amendments, especially with the emphasis on social stability and social partnership and all the emphasis on trying to deal with these social problems, is that it undermines the first two chapters of the Constitution. So when the Constitution was designed and submitted and approved, the first two chapters were on the individual rights and the functions of governance. And these were protected because in order to change them, they could only be changed by a constituent assembly. And of course, there's been no law about how to draft a constituent assembly. But these individual rights were perceived as the supreme value of the Constitution. And admittedly, they weren't always enforced, or they weren't enforced to the full capacity. But this was kind of the innovation of the 1993 Constitution, that it for the first time favored the independent rights and the freedoms of Russian citizens above all else. It was the supreme value. Now, the Constitution also included references to social rights. So the fact that the amendments emphasize social rights or deal with social rights is compatible with what was in the original Constitution. But I think that one of the consequences of this amendment process and the failure to kind of follow the direct procedure outlined in the Constitution was that it undermined the importance of the political rights and civil rights by emphasizing the social rights. And therefore, the balance between these two parts of the Constitution has been changed. And I think that is one of the strategies of Vladimir Putin. He has emphasized the need for social stability, not only in the run-up of the constitutional changes, but in many of his statements after the Constitution has been approved. So I think that one of the important aspects in terms of governance and the rights going forward is that the constitutional amendments returns to the emphasis on social stability and social rights to the detriment of individual rights. Regina, you want to speak about that as well? Or Paul wants to speak about that as well.
Thanks. I actually kind of wanted to get back to the broader question about, you know, the new system of public authority, although I think it touches on this last comment as well, which is, I think, to pull back to a broader picture and ask, you know, during the first 2 decades of Putin's rule, you know, a common question that a lot of people were asking was, why doesn't Putin just change the constitution to stay in power? Well, okay, so he's done that. All right. So if that's the case, then, you know, are we really investing that much into the discussion about the implications of formal institutional changes at this point? I think the points that Fabian raised, particularly regarding over-centralization and over-personalization, are important ones. There are also questions that there are also points that we made, so those of us who were focusing on regional politics, say like 10 years ago, were making with regards to Putin's federal reforms. And so I wonder, you know, to what extent can we actually look at these constitutional reforms as a way of starting to establish some of the metrics for what we might consider over-centralization or over-personalization of politics, and start to think about then at what point does politics as a going concern that involves constant institutional, even constitutional changes, ultimately then has a counteracting effect insofar as it no longer generates stability, it no longer generates compliance, it no longer generates loyalty, but then potentially has a countervailing effect.
Regina, you wanted to jump in as well.
I did, and I just I wanted to point out 2 things. Vladimir Gelman talked about digitization, and I think one thing we could think about is how digitization is a new mode of centralization, right? Because it takes regional officials out of benefits distribution and makes direct linkages to federal bodies in some cases. And there's been a lot of discussion about this in sort of online discussions with Putin and so forth. But I also wanted to note that in our paper, I think one of the arguments Sarah and I are making is that, in a sense, this was an attempt with social policy to give an illusion of less bad governance by defining an agenda, right? So here, the social changes define not only a political agenda that the state feels like it could maybe manage, although we saw problems last week, but also a political platform for upcoming elections. So while Putin is clearly, you know, Putin staying in power is clearly critical here, I think we're now engaged in a permanent campaign where a lot of this is about electoral management and electoral campaigns and so forth. So I wanted to put that idea on the table for our discussion.
And Sarah wanted to jump in.
Well, listening to this conversation, I think what stands out to me is that what's really significant about the constitutional amendments is that it creates this bind for the government with these dual tactics. So Yvonne and Ben were both emphasizing the institutionalization of power, right? That the formal institutions are getting stronger. And Ben very rightly noted that this is the central thing, is the zeroing amendment, and that Putin can run again and can stay in power. And so there's this bind, though, that on the one hand, Putin can stay in power and there's a formalizing of institutions. So he can stay in power. United Russia can potentially stay in power. And on the second, they want people to want them to stay in power. So they offer these things that are unrealistic and not credible that they've always promised. They strategically deliver, but it's also important to emphasize, and Regina and I write about this in our paper, that these social policy promises often go to specific groups. We can tell this is a tactic because they seem to think there are core constituencies, right? Even the increasing the retirement age, they opted out whole groups of people. I mean, there's like a list of like a dozen different categories of people not affected by the increase in retirement age, and that's before the constitutional amendment, but they create these selective categories. So it's this bind where you can stay in power, but also you want people to want you to stay in power. But that second part, we're not really sure how well that's going to work, that people wanting you to stay in power.
Thanks. We're going to go to questions soon. A reminder that you can email your questions to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter at Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. Oops, let's go to Vladimir and kind of to wrap up the discussion on governance, because I want to phrase it with the question. Obviously, we've talked about centralization of power, personalization of power, and yet Putin also used these amendments to get some additional security for himself. He's expanded his right to immunity, not just in office, but after office. He's introduced the right to have ex-presidents join the Federation Council. So to what extent is this simply a perpetuation of bad governance, and to what extent is Vladimir Putin looking over his shoulder at the time that maybe he won't be in power?
Well, it's true that Putin greatly expanded his formal and informal powers upon approval of constitutional amendments. But at the same time, as Fabian correctly mentioned, this overexpansion of presidential power not resulted in improving of institutional performance. And this is a paradox which may be labeled quite the opposite to a famous statement of Václav Havel many decades ago as power of powerless. This is powerlessness of the powerful. A very powerful president cannot improve major holes in the system of governance. And please note that the very approval of constitutional changes happens exactly at the midst of a pandemic, which has resulted in excessive mortality of more than 300,000 of Russians, quite a bit. However, it simply doesn't matter for political system, even thought there are some success stories like making of a new vaccine, which was a great success story. But at the same time, the president very much concerned about selling this vaccine abroad for foreign policy purposes, rather than in providing quick vaccination for his own fellow citizens. And this is exactly the side effect of over-personalization and over-centralization, because policy priorities of a president may define the very fate of ordinary citizens. So it's quite the opposite of declarations of social policy and the like outlined by Sarah and Regina. And this is the essence of problems of bad governance. That's it.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. We're going to go to our questions now. First question is submitted by Susan Sternthal, and she asks, how can Russia change politically if the population, at least according to the Levada Center's recent polls, shows large numbers of people who are apathetic about politics, believe Navalny was not actually poisoned, etc. To what extent then is Putin relying on the apathy or the non-politicization of the Russian people? And to what extent really can he continue to rely on that? Regina, and then did I see Paul? Regina, then Paul.
So I think it's a moment of rapid change in Russia. And there was a new poll out last week that showed very different attitudes, including opposition to Putin returning to office, significant opposition. So attitudes are very, very quickly changing in this moment. I'm not sure that polls are capturing these changes in attitudes because a national sample, you may not be able to sort of generalize about all pensioners from the set of pensioners included in the national samples now. They're pretty restrictive. Focus groups show very different kinds of attitudes that are much more reflect social change. So I think that I don't want to predict a society waking up, but there's a difference between apathy and alienation. When people are apathetic and disengaged, then they don't come back to life quickly. When people are alienated by the government or understand they have to perform in this sort of model of plebiscitary autocracy that Yudin talks about, then it's quicker for them to re-engage in politics if politics gets interesting and exciting. So I'm less negative about this sort of general idea, although not predicting revolution.
Paul, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, if I could, just a couple of quick points. First is that, I think it's difficult to disentangle the extent to which the public is apathetic or apolitical from the regime's legitimating discourse. In other words, what is expected of people, what are people actually believe is their normative obligation or commitment, not just to society, but also in the political sphere. Patriotism, at least the way it's practiced by the Kremlin as a form of legitimation, is really brittle, especially when it's based on the way that the regime monopolizes patriotic discourse. And there is a yawning divide, a yawning gap between official forms of patriotism and the ways that people understand it on an everyday basis. And this is something that I've written about and kind of squeezed into my own paper for the special issue. So that's one thing. And I think that what that means is there is the potential for the situation to change very quickly. And certainly we have seen this in other situations in autocracies where public opinion seems to be very much disengaged and then suddenly becomes rapidly very engaged. Centralization of authority, something that we've been talking about to this point, has an unintended consequence in that it increases the range of non-political issues that can be inadvertently politicized. And it also facilitates blame attribution because the more centralized politics are, the more everybody knows ultimately who's to blame and who's to hold responsible. And so that also potentially facilitates mobilization if it comes to that. And then the last thing I would say is just by way of comparative context, if we were to think about electoral revolutions that have occurred in the post-Soviet space, particularly the color revolutions in the 2000s, in those situations, we're talking about 10% of the public that was mobilized in any given case, right? So we're not talking about the need for the vast mobilization of society to occur in order for there to be a change. The vast majority of people may be concentrated on day-to-day survival issues or concerns of family or what have you. That's perfectly normal, actually, in a comparative perspective. But I think that very low threshold for mobilization also tells us something about why the Kremlin is so sensitive about ensuring a legitimating discourse is something which is being constantly replicated at every level of society and government.
Thanks. A follow-up question. Follow-up question from Jeff Hahn. Thomas Remington argued that a major goal of Gorbachev's reforms was to create buy-in to the government system. Is Putin attempting a similar strategy by creating elite buy-in? I guess, Paul, if you could address that initially, that would be great.
I think it's already there, honestly. I think the process of creating and producing these amendments actually demonstrates the extent of elite buy-in. It wouldn't have happened, from my perspective at least, from my analysis, if there wasn't already elite buy-in in the system. And what you saw in the process of the debates over these amendments was sort of various elites falling over themselves, first to sort of riff on, to replicate and extend the patriotic and social proposals initially made by Putin, seeking his, approval where possible, reining it in where he would occasionally sort of indicate his objections. But ultimately, I mean, if we're going to look at these reforms as something more than just a top-down imposition, then we have to accept the fact that there is a degree of what Green and Robinson referred to as the co-construction of authoritarianism, and that's not just on the elite level, but it's also on the mass level too.
Sarah.
So I don't really see what Putin's doing is at all similar to what Gorbachev did in the 1980s, although I'm sure my other panelists will correct me if they have different impressions. But Chris Miller and others have compared Putin more actually to Brezhnev for the length of time in power and sort of the stagnating living conditions in terms of, I don't see as Putin what he's doing and getting sort of elite buy-in. It is a very top-down imposition, and it's a continuation of these sort of unrealistic promises. And it's not any kind of opening up. It's in fact institutionalizing a formal power that will allow them to, from their perspective, hopefully deal with any opposition very quickly and shut it down. Because as Paul notes, you don't necessarily have to have a huge swath of the population on the streets for it to be a big problem. And a huge number would be 10%. I mean, it could even be 2-3%, and that would be very problematic potentially. Yeah.
To be clear, I wasn't likening Putin to Gorbachev, but the
no.
top-down process of
I was answering the
buy-in.
question, not disagreeing with your response at all, but just responding to the question.
Okay, our next question comes from Brian Taylor at Syracuse University. Kirill Rogov has argued the recent protests have shown that Putin has not succeeded with his goal in constitutional reform of not being a lame duck. Unlike in Central Asia, for example, there seems to be considerable social opposition to having a president for life. Does the panel agree or disagree with Rogov? Did Putin solve the 2024 problem or not? Nikolai.
Thanks, Brian. I would certainly agree with Kirill Rogov. And it's, I think, the most interesting question now, and it's a huge problem for Putin. That's why he is postponing his presidential address, not for the first time. It's needed now for him to revise or to adopt the new strategy, how to make himself not a poisoned asset for elites, but the base for stability of the whole system. And this is a very important thing, because we should understand that the constitutional reform is only part of the political transformation, which is aimed to let Putin to keep in power after 2024, not necessarily in his present capacity of the daily president, but perhaps of a monthly president, the one who could keep control over the system, but who could avoid of being involved into daily activities. And so far it was going on well until very recently, when due to the political crisis caused by Navalny, a kind of Navalny gate, Putin did start to lose his popularity. And recently Vada Center poll did show that although approval rating of Putin formally is almost the same as it used to be half a year ago, the level of trust to Putin has declined from 32 to 29%, and it's going down. And the problem is that Navalny, even if staying in prison, did already damage Putin's legitimacy, and this is huge risk for the whole system. So I would compare the situation now with the political crisis in 2011, 2012, which finally has led to the annexation of Crimea. So, and in my view, the very adoption of this so-called Putin's constitution was initially planned as a kind of celebration, the final stage of this glorious way Russia passed being led by Putin starting from 2014. It did not play this role. And now we see that Putin is back to the position he was prior to Crimea, not in terms just of figures, but in terms of the fact that political crisis is going on and there is no way out except for something which should be invented by Putin.
Ivan.
Yeah, if I can jump in just very briefly, I think that it might be that what Vladimir Putin was doing with the constitution is he was not solving as much the problem of 2024, but rather the problem of 2021, when the Duma elections will be held this September. And if you think about the timing of constitutional amendments, well, if it was about 2024, then it's a little too early unless the Duma elections are part of the picture. And I think this is how this question is connected to the previous two questions, because it's not as much about the population, but rather about what all kinds of political elites on the regional level, on the national level are doing, and especially how they prepare for this very important Duma elections, which should be held this year. If Vladimir Putin would not have sent this signal that, you know, guys, we are thinking about 2024, I might stay, then it could have happened that the regime would start actually unraveling already in 2021, because the political elites would have to start thinking about their loyalties in, you know, in the run-up to the Duma elections. So I think the answer to the question about whether the problem was solved should be positive. Yeah, except it was the 2021 problem that Putin was solving. And I think he, well, it remains to be seen, but he has certainly improved his position in terms of what he'll get in September.
Well, could I please jump in with a small remark?
Yes.
First of all, I would not agree that the constitutional reform came too early if to think in terms of 2024. And here I am fully supported by Putin himself. The problem is that you cannot construct or change essentially design of the political system just on the eve of the new presidential elections. You should construct new institutions, but this is not function of the constitution only. You should let these institutions to work. You should understand how the system is capable to work after being changed. So in my view, Putin was planning to undertake all these changes earlier, and before only not 2018 crisis with several defeats in regional elections, we could see the constitutional reform earlier. Now, if to speak about 2021, this is exactly Rogov's point that the Kremlin now is much weaker than it used to be, say, half a year ago, because half a year ago, they did face certain potential problems connected with the smart voting model, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg and same in single mandate races. But now they do face much more serious problem connected with the fact that United Russia is going down, not only Putin, but everything else, because Putin is the base for the whole system. And if the United Russia will not let the Kremlin to keep its majority in the State Duma, then the whole transition should be changed.
Okay. Next question comes from, where did the question go? Elena.
Will?
Yes?
Sorry, I put my hand up and I just have a quick comment to
Then
make that relates
please
both to what
do,
Nikolai
please do,
said and
please do.
what Ivan said. Thank you very much. We shouldn't forget that at the moment, United Russia has a supermajority in the State Duma, which means that when it comes to passing federal constitutional laws and changes to the constitution, it's really easy. The State Duma will support the executive's agenda. Now, that was possible because in 2016, United Russia's approval ratings was much higher than it is now. But given the 2018 deeply unpopular pension reform, United Russia's approval rating at the moment is 30%, which puts the Kremlin in a much more difficult position and raises the possibility that United Russia might lose its supermajority in the September Duma elections. And then it makes it much trickier to pass all of the laws that Nikolai and I were looking at that are implementing the constitutional changes. That being said, I don't think we should get too carried away. If United Russia were to lose its supermajority or even its majority, it would be able to draw on the support, pro-executive support of other parties. And that's why we're seeing at the moment Just Russia merging with other political parties. And it seems to be that the presidential administration is sinking lots of resources into supporting the party so it can be relied upon. And we might see a coalition scenario of a number of parties that will support the executive's agenda. So I very much agree with Ivan that when talking about the constitutional changes, we shouldn't just be thinking about 2024. The 2024 problem and the succession problem, put differently, has not been solved. What Putin did in 2020 was just kick the can further down the road.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that? Okay, so I'm going to go to our next question from Elena Ponomaryova. And she asks, I recall an article by Daniel Tressman calling Russia a normal country for its level of development. Apparently, Professor Gelman disagrees. Thus, my question: what is the proper level of quality governance for Russia? Or according to Professor Gelman, any observable level of quality governance in a non-democratic state would be labeled not good enough. So Vladimir, I think you get the first crack at that.
Yeah, actually, Dan Treisman and Andrei Schleifer stated in 2004 that Russia faced with the same problems with its political system typical to mid-developed countries such as Turkey, for example. And this statement supposed to be very relevant. However, when we go to quality of governance indicators provided by the World Bank, by Transparency International, Rule of Law Index, and the like, we'll find out that Russia, which is supposed to be governed nearly on the same level like countries of Eastern Europe or Turkey, somehow governed worse than those of African states, which are much less developed than Russia. And this is the fundamental problem for the country. We should expect much better governance of Russia, not because of dichotomy versus authoritarianism, but rather because some of the authoritarian states are also performing better than Russia. And one of the reasons why it is so, because Russia's political regime provided not enough incentives for improving quality of governance, which are apparent for authoritarian states like China or, for example, Saudi Arabia. This is a fundamental problem for personalist authoritarian regimes, which have very slim chances for dynastic succession, unlike monarchies, and have a very weak system of internal checks and balances, like in one-party regimes such as in China or that in the Soviet Union. So my understanding that it's not because of authoritarianism as such, but rather because of particular form of authoritarianism dominated in Russia.
There we go. Okay, sorry about that. The next question comes from Marjorie Malnusan-Balzer from Georgetown University. It's a question for the panel, but especially Nikolai Petrov. Could you comment on the baked-in status of the leadership of the Russian people and culture in the Constitution? What has been the resonance of this?
Sorry, Will, could you please repeat it one more time?
Yes, the question is, could you comment on the baked-in status of the leadership of the Russian people and culture in the Constitution? What has been the resonance of this?
Well, I think that those amendments which are connected with special status of Russian people and of Russian language, well, came as the needed element to provide for a bigger majority in support of the constitutional changes. And if to look at how exactly everything has been accepted by Russian nationalists, I would say that not only other nations except for Russians did feel badly with regard to these changes, but Russian nationalists did feel badly as well. And that's the problem. In order to, to be pleased by certain groups, but being limited by all other groups, the Kremlin could not go too far. And in general, the result was negative, I would say, for both Russians and non-Russians. So in my view, it did not change a lot the essence of the system and the balance between different ethnic groups in Russia, but it did aggravate both Russians and non-Russians.
Just to follow up on that question as well, one of the important amendments that we haven't discussed is the question of the Russian language and the state-forming people, the Russian state-forming people, because indeed they did emphasize the influence of Russians in this national, multinational empire. And there was a discussion during the working groups about whether they should actually change the preamble of the Constitution and to insert language about just the Ruski people and the emphasis on the Russians. And ultimately, they did not want to change the preamble because the preamble referred to the multinational people of the Russian Federation. And many people on the working group, especially some representatives from Tatarstan, said that it would just, why open up this Pandora's box? Why actually insert this amendment? Because the rest of the Constitution talks about the multinational people and as the source of sovereignty in the Russian Constitution. So there was a debate or a side debate about what to do about the emphasis on Russia, on there was discussion about kind of referring to the victory of World War II in the preamble and so forth. And they ultimately decided not to do that. But again, they snuck those changes in the Constitution after chapters 1 and 2. So again, that kind of highlights the contradictions that have been introduced into the Constitution, because before they couldn't change chapters 1 and 2, but they were allowed to introduce the amendments later. And that gives us the Constitution more of a slapdash, from my perspective, feel to it. Let me get to the next question.
Well, could I just jump in there real quick, if you don't mind?
Please do, yes.
Thanks. I just wanted to add a couple of things that I think probably would build upon the very important points that you've just raised. One is that in those debates, about things like whether or not to include mention of the Ruski, narod as the state-bearing people, that it was, the main systemic parties that were making the proposals that really pushed a lot further than what was ultimately sort of discussed in the working group and then finally adopted. And so there was really a moderation of views in what was ultimately produced in the final document. But what came out was still, were things that have already been discussed, for instance, in previous drafts of the federal nationalities policy concept. And so these aren't new ideas either. They have been active, they've been persistent, they've manifested in different ways. It's unclear why these needed to go in the Constitution, like many of the other reforms, that there are ample ways that these could be pursued through federal legislation, for instance, without baking it into the Constitution, as we've come to say. The prohibition on detaching territory from Russia was one aspect that was promoted by one of the members of the working group, and apparently was claimed that had produced a great resonance and became sort of a prominent or keystone feature of these social patriotic amendments. But then, while the preamble wasn't changed, the idea of the respect for memory of defenders of the fatherland and a prohibition on demeaning their memory was adopted ultimately into the amendments, as well as making Russian the state language in all the territories. And one last thing to mention about minority peoples: while minority ethnic peoples' rights are recognized, bear in mind that Russia also, in the same packet of reforms, is not bound by treaties and law that conflict with the Constitution. And so while they're recognized domestically, that doesn't mean that international concerns about minority ethnic rights would be recognized domestically within Russia. And that was also a principal source of concern amongst minority ethnic peoples within Russia with regards to these reforms. So there has been some subtle changes, things that I think have been present for some time, especially in the elite discourses, but things which also have potentially substantially weakened sources of opposition and sources of rights for the non-Russian, non-ethnic Russian peoples within Russia.
That's a good point. And Yvonne, maybe you can just talk about the changes to the Constitutional Court and the attitude of the status of the Constitution vis-a-vis international court decisions.
Yeah, well, there has been, thanks for this question, there has been this long debate about how the Russian Constitutional Court would deal with situations when international tribunals are taking decisions which kind of override the decisions of the Russian Constitutional Court. And this debate has drawn additional attention last year when a specific mention has been introduced to the Constitution to the effect that, sorry, I cannot figure the exact wording that they have there, but basically the way people read it was that Russia would not always respect its international obligations, especially in the cases when those obligations go against its constitutional provisions. But again, that's one of those things that does not come, there's nothing new about it. It's actually the first discussion of whether something like that should have been written either in the Constitutional or the Russian Constitutional Court Act was in 2010 or even 2009, if I'm not mistaken. So these ideas were somewhere in the air. And then, when this conservative moment came to just write everything that people have thought about the Constitution into the Constitution, they just did, right? So, yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Great. The next question comes from Paul Fisher from 4 News Square, and the question is: the zeroing amendment is of course important, but what of the long-term view of the panel of the removal of the word consecutive on Article 81.3 of the Constitution? Is it meaningful and significant constitutional pre-commitment for every successive president that is not Putin or Medvedev? Anyone want to talk about the changes about the consecutive terms, that amendment? We'll go to Nikolai and then Ivan.
I do think that the initial goal was to avoid Medvedev's plans to be the president for longer than one term. But when Valentina Tereshkova came with zeroing presidential terms, it did lose this sense, and it doesn't make any difference because as it was easy for Putin to change the constitution, it will be easy for any other president, and the Kremlin does not plan that far from now.
Ivan.
Yeah, well, the important element here to keep in mind is that these amendments were introduced at different times. So the drop in the word consecutive amendment was introduced in January. And at this moment, people thought, all right, apparently Vladimir Putin is not going to run. Apparently he will only allow Medvedev to run for this one term in 2024. So there was all kind of speculation. But then indeed, just as Nikolai said, in March 2021, they have just dropped pretty much everything else when they just, allowed all of the previous presidents to run for 2 more terms, Medvedev, Putin. So yeah.
Ben.
And I think it could be as simple as it also allowed the Kremlin to sustain the narrative that there was an element to the change that was limiting presidential power, that they were reducing the possibility in the future, even though they say, but it's not going to apply to Putin because we're going to zero his presidential record. And certainly, this is the complexity of the constitutional reform and the choice selection of certain elements by the authorities to highlight them in a way that actually isn't faithful to other changes in it. So they can say, well, look, we're removing consecutive, so that might be a plus for the people who wanted a liberalizing change in the constitution more broadly. And so it could just be a question of spin and rhetoric. We also shouldn't forget that I think there was lots of improvisation along the way. It's not as if there was always a plan for all of this. We saw thinking evolve, we saw thinking change over time, and part of that could be in response to the elites changing thinking about constitutional reform, but as well as the population's response to these changes. We know that the Kremlin constantly is polling and has access to polls that aren't just the Levada polls that we see. And so they would tailor the changes that they were making in response to whether proposed changes went down well. I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. It's not as if there was a master plan from the 15th of January and within the Kremlin, they knew exactly what was going to happen. No, they responded to shifting conditions.
Fabian.
Yeah, one probably more general remark about the provision on term limits. I think what is important to remember that we have seen a long-term process of the erosion of the norm of term limits. So just to go back, I mean, it has started with the castling between 2008 and 2012. We also should remember that it was Medvedev in 2008 who actually extended the presidential term from 4 to 6 years, which is also considered by scholars the form actually of basically a soft form of weakening the constraints of the term limits. And I think and as Ivan mentioned, it was not introduced basically the zeroing in the January bill, but rather introduced later. So we have seen basically a very slow and erosion of this norm of term limits in basically in the constitutional framework. And I think this is due to the fact, and also basically the whole context that didn't just see like one amendment doing away with term limits altogether, but basically embedding this circumvention of term limits in a very comprehensive form. And I think the reason is really I would see it as a sort of a risk hedging strategy, because we know also from surveys, Paul Chasty has done really interesting surveys on this issue. We know that basically doing away with term limits is risky. It sends a clear signal to the elite. So, but all what Putin actually wants is basically granting clear signals what actually his plans are, and it's also a clear signal to the population. We know that basically opposition to doing away with term limits is associated with higher propensity to take actually in protests. It's very slow erosion of the norm of term limits. Basically, is I think a very conscious strategy of dealing with risks that are associated with prolongation of personalist rule and basically regime prolongation.
Okay, we're coming to the end of our question period, but several people have asked the question, will this constitution outlast Putin? So, any thoughts or comments about that? Vladimir.
Yeah, I don't know about physical time horizon for Putin, but my understanding is that if and when Putin will no longer be a Russian president, either he will be dead, or he will be overthrown, or he will step down in one way or another. The new Russian rulers will probably faced with the need of making of a new constitution. And the very mechanism of power, which is overly personalized and overly centralized, is highly unlikely to continue over next generations of rulers, especially given the fact that there are low chances for dynastic succession in regimes like those in Russia. This is not a monarchy like Saudi Arabia, and not a party-based mechanism of power. This is why I would expect that new rulers will need to adopt a new constitution, but it's too early to speak what exactly will be changed and in which ways. But I doubt that it will be the same constitution in 100 years from now.
Sarah.
So I think, as Vladimir said, that it's too early for us to really know or be able to answer it. I think that's absolutely right. But I would be shocked if they completely scrapped the Constitution and started from scratch. I can see scenarios where you could have some kind of transition in power, new leaders come in, and you could have further amendments and adjustments. But I would be surprised, at least, if we saw it completely scrapped. But I think what Vladimir said is actually the most accurate answer. 100 years from now, we're not likely to see the same constitution in place, but it's much too early to really know how a subsequent leader would adjust it. But I would be shocked if they fully scrapped it.
Quick answers, because I think lots of people want to chime in here at the end. Ivan, then Nikolai.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, just from the historical perspective, notice that Vladimir Putin did not adopt a new constitution, right? He amended the old one, the one adopted in 1993. And moreover, the constitution adopted in 1993 was not adopted immediately after the new political regime was established in Russia. So again, it took 2 years for the elites, you know, to brew the new constitution there. And it's not that easy to adopt constitutions. So for instance, in Russia, you need to have approval from, even to amend the constitution, you need to have approval from all of the regions, right? Russia is a federation. So there is a very strong element of stability to constitution in Russia. And I'm not sure it would be that easy to even amend it significantly, let alone adopt a new one.
Nikolai.
I would say something which is bad for constitutionalists. I am not constitutionalist at all. So I would say that constitution is not that important in Russia. And it's clearly seen it was possible for Putin to live while having Yeltsin's constitution. It's flexible enough. The new constitution, in my view, is even more flexible than the previous one. So any ruler can easily adjust, can easily violate the constitution in a way he wants. So in my view, the problem is connected only with the fact how Putin will go out. If he's overthrown, then we cannot exclude the possibility to decide that the old constitution should be restored, and that's all. If not, then the new one can be easily adjusted to any new rule.
Regina and Paul want to weigh in here. So Regina, then Paul.
So I want to agree with Nikolai that the Constitution itself was not that important, but changing the Constitution was important in very significant ways. And I think one way it was important is that it changed people's expectations about their orientation to the state. So it would be very hard, for example, to take away social benefits now, or to take away those promises. But I also think one thing that struck me watching live feeds of the last protest was, for the first time, the interviews with people on the street were talking a lot about rights. So talking about the Constitution also increased people's perceptions or of their rights, and even their political and civil rights, even though that wasn't the focus of this change. So we've seen an increase in the salience of rights protections that makes me think that this exercise didn't quite go as planned.
Paul?
Yeah, just quickly, I wanted to say that if we think about the sources of continuity, potential sources of continuity after Putin, the system, of course, isn't really designed to manage a post-Putin era at present. But I think there is a crucial difference between now and, say, if we look at the previous, era in the early 1990s, between the late Soviet era and the early 1990s, and that unlike that time, there are now organized political parties. There are now organized political interests that exist in a way that have social foundations, they have organizations, they have resources in a way that they did not, say, in the constitutional interim period between 1991 and 1993. And those organized interests are interested parties. They have vested interest in various elements of the Constitution. So I would expect that that would persist. I think also, if we think about legitimation after Putin, another crucial difference, of course, is the last 3 decades of Russia's existence as a sovereign, independent state. And the Constitution is a key symbol of that. And I think that that is also something that would likely lead to its preservation in some form, although it may well be, continually amended until it suits the purposes of whoever might possibly succeed at that point in time.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to bring the conversation to a close. I will just close by saying that Russia had 7 constitutions in the 20th century, and we can debate whether Putin represents another constitution, the first constitution of the 21st century, but the permanence of Russian constitutionalism has always been called in question, and I have no doubt that at an appropriate time there will be another constitution or another constitutional debate. I want to thank all our panelists for tuning in and for all your contributions. Another reminder that you can find the articles that are the subject of this discussion in an upcoming issue of Russian Politics, the journal. So thank you all for your participation. Thank you for your questions. And we look forward to seeing you at future Kennan Institute events. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Will, for running the conversation.